The mansion stood in silence, its grand facade weathered by decades of wind and rain, but even today, stepping through the heavy oak doors sends a chill down the spine. In 1921, when the Harrington family lived here, this was not a place of fear. It was a place of gatherings, of polished silver, of candles flickering over laughter and conversation. Yet when investigators entered on a cold evening nearly a century ago, what they found inside was a scene that would defy explanation. The dining room, the heart of the home, looked frozen in time. A white tablecloth stretched across the long oak table, plates neatly arranged, forks poised as if waiting for the next bite. Steaming roasts had long since gone cold. Glasses were half filled with red wine, deep burgundy reflecting the dim light like spilled blood. A clock ticked steadily on the mantel, the sound echoing louder than it should have in a house so utterly still. To those who first stepped into that room, it seemed as though the Harringtons had simply risen from their seats, intending to return in a moment, and yet, they never did. There were no signs of struggle. No shattered glass. No overturned furniture. Only one chair sat slightly askew, as though someone had risen quickly, perhaps startled. It was the smallest of disturbances, and yet in the context of that eerie stillness, it screamed louder than any broken window or forced door. A dinner interrupted, not ended. The food untouched, the candles half burned down, the scene waiting patiently for its participants to return. Neighbors who peered in after days of silence would later describe the moment with unease. They said the house felt alive, as though it was holding its breath. Some swore they heard the faintest echo of voices, or the ghostly clink of a spoon against china, though the room had been empty for hours, perhaps days. What chilled them most was not what they saw, but what they did not. There were no Harringtons. No sign of where they had gone, no trace of hurried departure. Their coats remained in the hall closet, shoes neatly lined against the wall, a newspaper folded on the front porch. It was as if the family had been swallowed whole, consumed by the very air inside their home. Stories of disappearances are not rare in history. People vanish, sometimes tragically, sometimes mysteriously. But an entire family, in the middle of dinner, without so much as a footprint leading away, that was something else entirely. It was the sort of thing that sears itself into the collective memory of a community, then spreads beyond it, feeding the imagination of strangers for generations. Even now, 100 years later, the Harringtons' table remains one of the most haunting images in true crime history, precisely because it feels unfinished. Like a melody that cuts off mid-note, leaving silence where resolution should be. The townsfolk, back in 1921, were terrified. Rumors spread faster than fact. Some whispered about robbers, others about curses. There were those who said the family had enemies, and those who insisted no force of man could make a family vanish so cleanly. Fear found a home in speculation, and speculation grew darker with each retelling. But fear could not fill the silence of that house, nor could it explain the cruel simplicity of the scene left behind. Imagine walking into a home where time itself feels broken, where the ordinary has been warped into something sinister. Every detail in that room begged a question, but none offered an answer. The dinner plates waited. The wine waited. The house waited. And the town found itself staring into a void, searching for a reason that never seemed to come. The image of that room has endured because it captures the essence of what terrifies us most, not violence, not chaos, but absence. A void where life should have been, a pause that stretches into eternity. The Harrington family sat down to a meal one evening in 1921, and by the time the world noticed, they were gone. Not a soul witnessed their departure. Not a clue revealed their fate. Only the dinner remained, quietly mocking the investigators who would spend years trying to piece together the story that began, and ended, at that table. And so the question still lingers, gnawing at anyone who dares to study the case: how can an entire family vanish without a trace, in the middle of dinner? The first signs that something was wrong at the Harrington mansion came not from the authorities, but from the people who lived just beyond its iron gates. The Harrington family was well known in town, not just for their wealth, but for their routines. Every Sunday morning, church bells marked their arrival in polished carriages. Every Friday evening, the aroma of cooking drifted through open windows, servants preparing for the family's gatherings. For days after their disappearance, those rhythms fell silent. The mansion's chimneys sent up no smoke. Its windows, usually glowing faintly with lamplight, were black. And from the Harringtons themselves, not a single word. At first, neighbors shrugged it off. Perhaps the family had gone away suddenly, some thought. A holiday, or an unexpected trip to relatives. But as one day bled into two, and then into three, unease spread. The milk left at their doorstep soured in the sun. The daily newspaper stacked in a neat pile, untouched. Horses in the stable shifted restlessly, uncared for. Servants, usually bustling about, were nowhere to be seen. The mansion did not merely seem empty, it seemed abandoned in mid-breath. By the fourth day, whispers began to stir in town. In a place where everyone knew each other's business, the Harrington silence was deafening. Rumors bred suspicion. Some swore they had seen a carriage leave late at night, though no tracks were found on the long gravel drive. Others claimed to have heard shouting from inside the mansion, muffled but frantic, before everything fell quiet again. Finally, it was a distant relative, uneasy with the lack of communication, who convinced the local sheriff to investigate. On a brisk evening, lanterns in hand, the sheriff and two deputies climbed the steps of the great oak doors. They knocked, called out, waited. Silence answered. The door, curiously, was locked from the inside. They circled the house, searching for entry. Windows were latched. Curtains drawn. No sign of intrusion, no obvious way in. Only one small window at the back pantry stood slightly ajar, as if left open to let out steam from cooking. That was their entry point. When the men finally forced their way through, the house greeted them with an almost physical weight of stillness. Dust hung in the lantern light. The air carried the faint, stale smell of food long neglected. They moved cautiously, boots echoing against the marble floor. And then they entered the dining room. The sight stopped them cold. Plates perfectly arranged. Food untouched but spoiled with age. Silverware laid neatly, as though awaiting a host who would never return. Wine glasses, some half-drained, others still full. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, indifferent to the mystery. It was a dinner preserved, like a photograph, frozen in place. Yet the most chilling detail was not the presence of these objects, but the absence of their owners. The room had been set for a family, but the family had simply vanished. The deputies searched the house from top to bottom. Bedrooms were neat, beds turned down as though ready for sleep. Wardrobes bulged with clothes still in place. Jewelry lay untouched. Nothing suggested robbery. The servants' quarters showed signs of hasty abandonment, an apron folded on a chair, a broom leaning against a wall mid-task. And yet no bodies, no blood, no clear evidence of where the Harringtons had gone. Back in town, news of the discovery spread like wildfire. People gathered outside the sheriff's office, demanding answers. Fear bred wild theories. Had they been kidnapped? Had they fled? Was there some curse upon the mansion? The local newspaper printed bold headlines the next morning: Harrington family missing, dinner left untouched. It was the kind of story that spread beyond the borders of the small town, drawing reporters and curious onlookers from neighboring counties. Soon, the Harrington mansion became less a home and more a spectacle, a riddle that strangers felt compelled to see for themselves. And with every retelling, the story grew stranger. Some insisted the family must have stepped outside and been ambushed. Others whispered that they had been spirited away, the work of something not human. For the children in town, the mansion quickly became a source of nightmares, a place parents warned them never to wander near. For the adults, it was a shadow hanging over their everyday lives, reminder that safety could vanish as suddenly as a candle flame. Yet amid the theories and hysteria, there were details that resisted explanation. One deputy reported that a chair in the dining room had been pushed sharply back, unlike the others, as though someone had risen in alarm. The sheriff brushed it off at first, but the image lingered. A single moment of disruption in an otherwise frozen tableau. A gesture of fear, captured in the stillness. The investigation would drag the authorities deeper into uncertainty, but on that first night, standing in the quiet mansion, one truth became undeniable. Something had torn the Harringtons out of their lives mid-meal, and whatever it was had left no trace behind. The sheriff ordered the house sealed, the rooms undisturbed, hoping to preserve clues that might surface later. But in doing so, he unwittingly preserved something else, the haunting silence of a dinner interrupted, a silence that would soon consume not just the house, but the entire town. The chair sat askew, a single piece of evidence in a room otherwise untouched. And as the sheriff stared at it, he could not shake the feeling that the answer to the mystery had begun in that very moment, when someone at the table rose abruptly, perhaps in fear, perhaps in defiance, and vanished before they could sit down again. The Harrington family had always seemed untouchable, perched high on the hill in their sprawling mansion overlooking the town. To outsiders, they represented a kind of American prosperity that felt unreachable, wealthy but dignified, polished yet private. Behind the tall hedges and wrought iron gates, the family lived a life that most could only glimpse during Sunday church services or through gossip passed across fences. Yet as investigators delved into the mystery of their disappearance, the polished facade began to fracture, revealing the complexity of the people who had sat at that ill-fated dinner table. At the head of the family was Charles Harrington, 54 years old, a man of firm posture and sharper words. He had built much of his fortune through shipping, supplying coal and timber across state lines, and was known for his ambition. In town, he was respected but not universally loved. Some saw him as generous, contributing heavily to local charities and the church, while others whispered of ruthless business dealings, men left bankrupt after crossing him. Those closest to him described a man who carried his burdens heavily, often retreating into his study late at night with brandy in hand. He was a father of tradition, demanding obedience from his children, loyalty from his staff, and perfection from himself. Yet even Charles, stern as he was, could not escape the creeping sense of unease that had begun to follow the family in the months before their disappearance. His wife, Margaret, was of a different temperament. At 49, she was the softer presence in the household, admired for her charitable work, her refined manners, and her ability to smooth over her husband's sharp edges. Where Charles demanded, Margaret reassured. Where he closed doors, she opened them. Friends described her as the heart of the family, the one who held them together through her patience and quiet strength. And yet her private letters, found later in her desk, suggested something darker beneath the surface. She often wrote of feeling watched, of shadows passing the windows when no one was there, of waking in the night to silence so heavy it pressed on her chest. Whether this was a woman's fragile nerves or an early sign of something more sinister has never been answered. The Harrington children painted an even more complex picture. The eldest, Thomas, was 22, a young man groomed to follow in his father's footsteps. He carried himself with the same sternness, though less earned by experience and more borrowed from ambition. He was rumored to have a temper, and several townsfolk whispered of late-night arguments with his father about the direction of the family business. One account, preserved in the diary of a neighbor, claimed that Thomas had been seen leaving the mansion weeks before the disappearance, his face red with anger, muttering that he wouldn't live under his father's rule forever. Eleanor, the middle child at 19, was considered the jewel of the family, beautiful, poised, admired by many young men in town. But Eleanor was not content with her gilded cage. Friends recalled her fascination with the world beyond the gates, her eagerness to attend dances and social gatherings despite her father's disapproval. Rumors swirled that she had been secretly courting a man far below her station, a scandal that would have shaken the family name had it been confirmed. Letters tucked into her vanity hinted at a romance, though the identity of the man remained a mystery. Some believed her secret relationship could have led to conflict, perhaps even blackmail. The youngest, Henry, was only 12. Bright-eyed and curious, he was the most beloved by townsfolk, often seen playing near the estate's orchards or helping stable hands feed the horses. He was described as sensitive, easily frightened by the dark, but endlessly loyal to his mother. Teachers at the local school remembered his drawings, strange sketches of dark figures at windows, or sprawling houses with too many doors. At the time, no one thought much of it. After the disappearance, those drawings seemed to carry a more ominous weight. The Harrington household was not without its servants either, and their lives wove tightly into the fabric of the family's story. Anna, the head maid, had served them for over a decade, and was said to know the family's secrets better than anyone. There was also Samuel, the chauffeur, a man fiercely protective of Eleanor, whose presence was noted as too close by some. Several younger maids and kitchen staff rotated through the house, but it was Anna and Samuel who were most deeply entangled in the Harringtons' daily lives. Both vanished alongside the family, their fates equally unexplained. What emerges from these fragments is not a portrait of perfection, but of a family teetering between appearances and private tensions. They were bound by love, yes, but also by secrets, secrets of business rivalries, forbidden romance, fears unspoken, and children yearning to escape the weight of expectation. Each of them brought something to that dinner table on the night of their disappearance, Charles with his stern authority, Margaret with her quiet unease, Thomas with his restless ambition, Eleanor with her concealed longings, Henry with his innocence, and the servants with their watchful loyalty. When investigators combed through their belongings, they found small details that cast long shadows. In Charles's study, letters from a rival businessman threatened lawsuits and hinted at debts far greater than the town realized. In Margaret's drawer, a note scribbled in haste, "He is at the window again." In Eleanor's room, a pressed flower hidden inside a love letter, its edges smudged by tears. Even Thomas's journal carried passages of resentment, lines scrawled in anger that spoke of an end to all this. Perhaps the most haunting discovery was Henry's school notebook, left open on his desk. On the final page he had drawn a table, long and rectangular, with 6 figures seated around it. But at the head, where his father should have been, he had drawn only a dark outline, faceless, looming. It is these fragments that transform the Harringtons from a nameless missing family into something far more intimate and unsettling. They were not symbols, not simply a wealthy clan who vanished in silence, they were people, flawed and fragile, with desires and fears that mirror our own. And that is what makes their disappearance so chilling. When a stranger vanishes, it is easy to assign mystery. When a family like this vanishes, one can almost hear their voices lingering in the empty rooms, the weight of their arguments, their laughter, their secrets. By the time the town realized they were gone, those voices had already been swallowed. All that remained were the letters, the diaries, the drawings, each one a breadcrumb pointing toward the same dark conclusion: the Harringtons had been living under a shadow long before the night they vanished. And in their silence, that shadow only deepened. When the sheriff ordered the mansion searched more thoroughly, lanterns in hand, the deputies moved slowly from room to room, each step echoing against polished wood floors that seemed to groan under the weight of their intrusion. The house, once a place of warmth and gathering, now carried the chill of abandonment. Every door they pushed open revealed not chaos but eerie order, as though the Harringtons had expected to return at any moment. And yet, everywhere they looked, time had stopped in unsettling ways. The dining room remained the anchor of the mystery, its details meticulously catalogued. A roast, still sitting in the center of the table, had spoiled but retained its shape, the meat congealed into an almost wax-like form. A bowl of potatoes had grown a fuzz of mold. The wine glasses had collected dust around their rims. On one side of the table, a napkin lay crumpled in a way that suggested sudden movement, perhaps a hand dropping it mid-motion. The sheriff noted that the silver candlesticks had burned unevenly, one melted nearly down to the base, the other tall and untouched. Was this evidence of a draft or something more? No one could say. Moving into the parlor, the deputies found a room suspended between life and silence. A newspaper was folded neatly on the coffee table, dated the day of the disappearance. Its ink had smudged faintly where someone's thumb had pressed too firmly. A pipe, still filled with unburned tobacco, rested on the mantel. Cushions were slightly indented, as if someone had only just risen from them. On the piano, sheet music sat open to a hymn that Margaret was known to favor. A lamp had been switched on, its oil long since burned away, leaving a blackened wick. All these details spoke of routine, of a life unfolding as it always had, interrupted only by an absence that could not be explained. Upstairs, the children's rooms told quieter stories. In Eleanor's room, a vanity mirror reflected dust motes dancing in the lantern glow. A hairbrush lay across the table, strands of her long brown hair still caught between the bristles. A jewelry box sat open, pearl earrings arranged neatly, untouched by theft. Beneath the bed, deputies discovered letters tied together with a ribbon, though they were careful not to disturb them until the sheriff could review them personally. On her nightstand, a candle had burned down completely, the wax hardened into a pool that had spilled onto the wood. It was as if she had sat awake long into the night, unable to sleep. In Thomas's room, a journal sat open on his desk, filled with sharp, hurried handwriting. His coat was draped across a chair, boots aligned at the foot of his bed. A half-written letter, ink smeared as though abandoned mid-thought, mentioned the meeting, but offered no further explanation. The sheriff, skimming the page, frowned. Meeting with whom? Henry's room carried the most haunting stillness. Toys sat lined against the wall, wooden soldiers, a spinning top, a small train set. A book lay open on his pillow, its pages marked by a child's careful fold at the corner. His school notebook was open on the desk, and again deputies noticed his odd sketches, dark figures near windows, faceless silhouettes. But it was the closet door that unsettled them most. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had stepped inside in haste. The deputy pushed it open slowly. Nothing but neatly hung shirts and shoes on the floor. Yet the air inside felt heavier, colder, a pocket of silence within silence. The servants' quarters were humbler but no less revealing. Anna's apron was folded across a chair, beside a basin of water that had long since gone stagnant. A sewing project was left unfinished on her nightstand, needles still threaded as if she meant to return to it after supper. Samuel's quarters were similarly intact, boots by the door, his cap hung on a hook. On the small desk was a note with a single unfinished line, "She deserves better than," before the ink trailed off, the pen dropped mid-thought. The sheriff would later wonder whether she referred to Eleanor. In the kitchen, remnants of the meal preparation remained, flour dusted across the counter, knives still out, vegetables half-sliced. A pot of broth had cooled into an oily film. The back door was locked, bolted from the inside. The pantry window, the one slightly ajar, became the only possible point of entry or exit. Yet even there, the dust on the sill was undisturbed. If someone had climbed in or out, they had done so without leaving the faintest trace. The study, Charles Harrington's domain, yielded the first real crack in the veneer of ordinary domestic life. Papers covered the desk, ledgers of shipping accounts, correspondence with business partners, contracts in neat stacks. Yet in one locked drawer, pried open by the deputies, they found letters that did not belong to business. The first was unsigned, written in a jagged hand, "You will pay for what you've done. There is no hiding from what is owed." Another was more cryptic, mentioning debts and betrayal, but offering no names. Tucked beneath these was a single piece of stationery, folded twice, bearing only one line, "Your family will not save you." The sheriff's hands trembled slightly as he read. Suddenly, the disappearance no longer seemed like an accident or flight. It felt deliberate, targeted. The study smelled faintly of brandy, though the glass on the desk had dried to a sticky ring. A small clock sat on the shelf, its face cracked, hands frozen at 7:14. Whether it had broken on its own or been stopped intentionally was unclear. But the time, burned into their notes, would become a detail investigators returned to again and again. As the deputies gathered in the hallway, lantern light flickering against the grand staircase, a sense of unease grew heavier with each discovery. This was not simply a family vanishing into the night. This was a family stalked by something, financial ruin, personal vengeance, or something more shadowy, that had left behind traces too subtle to connect, yet too sinister to ignore. The mansion, in its silence, whispered contradictions. Every room preserved in perfection, yet each holding a detail that screamed of interruption: the crumpled napkin, the unfinished letters, the burned-out candle, the tipped-back chair. It was as though the house itself knew what had happened but refused to give up its secrets. When the sheriff finally stepped back into the dining room, lantern casting long shadows across the untouched table, his eyes fell again on the tipped chair. The wood gleamed dully under the light, the legs uneven against the polished floor. It was the only sign of struggle, if it could even be called that. A chair out of place, a gesture frozen in wood. And yet, combined with the threatening letters, it suggested something chilling, that the Harringtons had not simply disappeared, they had been taken in the midst of life, pulled from their home while the walls stood silent witness. The sheriff closed the drawer in the study, but the words on that last letter clung to him like a curse. "Your family will not save you." The Harrington mansion may have been the center of the mystery, but the longer investigators lingered in town, the more they realized the story stretched far beyond the house on the hill. The disappearance of an entire family was not merely a crime, it was a rupture in the fabric of the community. And into that rupture, suspicion flooded like water into a crack. Everyone had a theory, and more importantly, everyone had someone to blame. The first suspect named was the most obvious: Charles Harrington's disgruntled business partner, Leonard Whitmore. Leonard was a man in his early 60s, once wealthy in his own right but brought low after a series of failed investments. In the months leading up to the Harringtons' disappearance, Leonard and Charles had been locked in bitter legal disputes. Townsfolk remembered heated arguments in the courthouse steps, Leonard shouting that Charles had ruined him. His finances had crumbled, his properties repossessed. More than once, Leonard was heard muttering in the tavern, "If I go down, I'll take him with me." To investigators, Leonard's resentment made him an ideal suspect. He had motive: revenge. He had opportunity, he lived close enough to the Harrington estate to know their habits. But when deputies brought him in for questioning, Leonard's alibi was maddeningly solid. On the night of the Harringtons' final dinner, he claimed to have been at the town lodge, playing cards with 3 witnesses who reluctantly confirmed his presence. He spat venom at Charles even under interrogation, but his bitterness seemed almost too obvious, too convenient. The sheriff suspected Leonard enjoyed the attention, basking in his role as the community's villain, but whether he was truly guilty remained uncertain. If Leonard embodied the town's open hostility toward the Harringtons, the next suspect lurked in the shadows of scandal. Rumors had long whispered of Eleanor Harrington's secret romance. The letters in her room suggested as much, though the identity of her lover was cloaked in mystery. Some believed it was Samuel, the family chauffeur, a man whose loyalty to the family was unquestioned, but whose closeness to Eleanor had raised eyebrows. He was protective, always at her side, and more than one person had seen the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought no one noticed. Samuel, however, vanished with the family. If he was Eleanor's lover, he was also among the missing. Did he orchestrate their disappearance to elope with her, or was he simply a victim caught in the storm? Those who had known him described him as soft-spoken, kind, but with a streak of defiance. A stable boy recalled overhearing him argue with Charles one evening, voices raised, Charles accusing him of forgetting his place. No one could prove what the argument was about. The implication was clear enough: if Samuel was in love with Eleanor, Charles would never have allowed it. And yet, some townsfolk rejected the notion of Samuel as villain. They painted a different picture: a man who would have died protecting the family, not harmed them. If he disappeared with them, perhaps he was trying to shield Eleanor from something darker, something that had nothing to do with romance at all. Then there was Anna, the maid, who had also vanished. To many, she seemed beyond suspicion, a woman of loyalty, in service to the Harringtons for more than a decade. But loyalty can mask secrets. She was the one who moved freely through the house, who knew which doors creaked, which windows jammed. She knew the family's schedule better than anyone, their quarrels and their joys alike. And though few dared speak it aloud, some believed she may have known too much. A former servant, dismissed from the household years earlier, whispered to deputies that Anna had once threatened to bring the Harrington name down after an argument over unpaid wages. No record of such a threat remained, but in a town starved for answers, rumor was enough to poison reputations. Beyond the mansion, other suspects emerged from the wider world of Charles Harrington's business dealings. Rivals in the shipping trade had reasons to despise him. He was known to undercut competitors, secure exclusive contracts, and wield his wealth like a weapon. One name in particular surfaced, a man named Franklin Doyle, who had filed a lawsuit against Harrington's company mere months before the disappearance. Though Franklin lived several counties away, his threats were recorded in letters, angry promises that ruin would come to Charles if debts were not paid. The sheriff requested deputies to trace Franklin's whereabouts, but in those early days, travel records were spotty, and no one could place him with certainty. Suspicion also fell inward, within the family itself. Thomas, the eldest son, had clashed with his father repeatedly. His journal hinted at resentment, his temper was notorious, and his ambition made him unpredictable. Could he have staged an escape, taking his family with him, or worse, eliminating them? To suggest such a thing seemed monstrous, yet investigators could not ignore the words scrawled in his diary, an end to all this. Theories spiraled outward. Some townsfolk swore strangers had been seen lurking near the property, men in dark coats, unfamiliar faces who vanished when confronted. Others whispered of travelers passing through, criminals who had chosen the Harringtons as their victims. The idea of an outside gang sweeping into town and leaving without a trace was terrifying, yet strangely comforting. It meant the danger was not one of their own. But not everyone was so willing to believe in strangers. Fear poisoned the community. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, friendship strained under the weight of whispered accusations. At the tavern, patrons lowered their voices when the Harrington name arose. The sheriff, walking down the main street, could feel the eyes of the townspeople burning into him, demanding answers he did not have. One lead, however, pushed the investigation into darker territory. A man named Walter Green, a drifter who had done occasional work on the Harrington estate, vanished from town a week after the family's disappearance. He was known to be unreliable, sometimes violent when drinking, and he had been seen near the estate in the days leading up to the vanishing. Some claimed he had been trying to sell a pocket watch suspiciously similar to one Charles Harrington owned. Others insisted they had seen him boarding a train late at night, luggage in hand, leaving behind his debts. When deputies searched his small rented room, they found it abandoned in haste, bed unmade, belongings scattered, as though he had fled suddenly. Among the mess was a scrap of paper with the words, "It is done. Don't look for me." The sheriff held the note in his hand, feeling a chill. Walter Green's disappearance was no coincidence. But was he a man fleeing justice, or was he another thread in a web far larger than anyone had imagined? The Harrington case quickly grew beyond the capacity of a small-town sheriff's office. What had begun as a missing persons investigation became, within weeks, a matter of national intrigue. Newspapers across the state picked up the story, each headline more sensational than the last: "Family vanishes into thin air. Dinner left untouched as Harringtons disappear." Reporters descended on the town, flooding the sheriff's office with questions he had no answers to. Each journalist seemed more determined than the last to shape the mystery into something extraordinary, and their words only added fuel to the fire of public hysteria. For Sheriff William Carter, a man unaccustomed to such scrutiny, the weight was suffocating. He had been elected for his steady hand and reputation for fairness, but now his name was whispered with frustration in the taverns, his face drawn in caricatures in newspapers, depicted as a fool chasing ghosts. Every morning when he opened his office door, townsfolk waited outside demanding progress. Every evening, he walked home under the heavy gaze of a community that believed their safety depended on his answers. The truth was that Carter and his deputies had very little to work with. Forensic science in the early 1920s was primitive by modern standards. Fingerprinting was possible, but the Harrington mansion yielded smudges too blurred to identify. Blood analysis was still in its infancy, and none was found at the scene anyway. There were no footprints, no broken locks, no sign of forced entry. The mansion seemed almost deliberately scrubbed of evidence, though the order of the rooms suggested otherwise. It was not staged to appear empty, it simply was. Leads evaporated as quickly as they appeared. Leonard Whitmore, the bitter business partner, remained an obvious suspect, but his alibi held. Franklin Doyle, the rival businessman from another county, denied involvement, and though his threats were undeniable, he insisted his anger was financial, not murderous. The rumor of Eleanor's secret romance offered tantalizing avenues, yet without Samuel, or Eleanor, there was no way to confirm the truth. The town drunk swore he had seen strangers lurking near the mansion, but when pressed for detail, he contradicted himself so many times the sheriff dismissed him as unreliable. The case began to take on an almost supernatural aura. Townsfolk claimed to see lights flickering in the windows at night, though the house had been sealed. Others reported shadows moving across the curtains. But the story that most unsettled Carter came from two neighbors who lived across the field. They swore that 3 nights after the sheriff had searched the mansion, long after the family was presumed missing, they heard music drifting from the estate. Not faint noises carried by wind, but clear, deliberate notes of a piano. It was Margaret's piano, they said, the one in the parlor, still holding sheet music open to a hymn she often played. The neighbors were adamant, insisting they could hear it as though someone were rehearsing late into the evening. Carter dismissed it publicly, wary of feeding hysteria, but privately the claim gnawed at him. He knew the piano had been silent when he left the house. He had checked it himself, even pressed a key, its note sharp in the still air. So how could music have returned to a place he had locked with his own hands? Haunted by doubts, Carter revisited the mansion at night. The deputies balked at the idea, reluctant to step foot in the house after dark, but Carter insisted. Lanterns in hand, they entered the silent hallways once more, every creak of the floorboards magnified by the oppressive quiet. In the parlor, the piano sat exactly as it had before, its sheet music unmoved, its keys gathering dust. Yet the neighbors swore they had heard it. Carter pressed a few notes, their sound hollow, almost mocking. Nothing in the house seemed disturbed. And yet, as they left, one deputy whispered that he thought he had heard something upstairs, a faint shuffle, too heavy for rats. They searched, of course. They found nothing. The deputies began to fray under the pressure. Some grew superstitious, claiming the house was cursed, that stepping inside invited doom. Others grew resentful of Carter's persistence, muttering that he was chasing phantoms while the town turned against him. One, Deputy Jameson, resigned altogether, declaring he would not spend another night in that place of the dead. Carter himself grew gaunt, the burden of failure eating away at him. He spent long nights in his office, poring over notes, mapping timelines, trying to force sense out of chaos. Even outside the investigation, the case poisoned the town. Friends accused friends of withholding information. Business partners eyed each other warily. Some households locked their doors at dusk, convinced that if the Harringtons could vanish without trace, anyone could. The church saw a surge in attendance, prayers offered for protection. Yet the fear was not holy, it was desperate, tinged with suspicion. A family had been swallowed whole, and the community demanded to know by whom, or by what. Carter sought help from the state, hoping outside investigators might bring clarity. A detective from the city arrived, sharp-eyed and confident, but even he found himself stymied by the mansion's silence. His report concluded grimly, no evidence of forced entry. No evidence of struggle. No bodies. No explanation. He returned to the city within a week, leaving Carter more isolated than ever. Meanwhile, the press continued to invent stories where facts failed. Some claimed the Harringtons had staged their own disappearance, fleeing debts or scandal. Others spun tales of cults, of midnight rituals, of sacrifices in the woods. Each article made the case more sensational, but less solvable. The sheriff's office became not just a center of investigation but of ridicule. The more the nation obsessed, the less progress was made. Carter began to question himself. Had he missed something obvious? A footprint overlooked? A hidden door? He returned to the mansion again and again, searching every corner, tapping walls, lifting rugs. Once, in the study, he sat in Charles Harrington's chair, staring at the threatening letters, and wondered what kind of man had enemies who promised destruction. He stared at the line, "Your family will not save you," and felt a chill. It was not just a threat against Charles, it was a promise that those around him would suffer for his sins. And yet, the deeper Carter went, the more the case resisted him. Witnesses contradicted each other. Suspects evaporated. Rumors multiplied. Every lead circled back into silence. The mansion seemed to mock him, its rooms unchanged, its tables still waiting, as though time itself had conspired against him. One night, exhausted, Carter sat in his office staring at the clock on the wall. It ticked steadily, the same rhythm as the one in the Harrington dining room. He realized then that he had begun to hear it in his dreams, the ticking, the silence, the frozen moment that refused to move forward. The Harringtons were trapped in that moment, and so was he. And then, another report came. A farmhand, passing near the estate in the dead of night, claimed he saw a figure in an upstairs window. Not a shadow, not a trick of the moon, but a man, standing motionless, watching the fields. The farmhand swore it. His description chilled Carter to the bone, tall, broad-shouldered, but faceless in the dark. The sheriff clenched his jaw as he listened. The mansion was sealed. The family was gone. But if the farmhand spoke true, then something, or someone, was still inside. When facts dry up, theories multiply. By the winter of 1921, the Harrington case had grown less like an investigation and more like a story told in whispers, each retelling adding details the sheriff never confirmed. Without bodies, without evidence, and without resolution, the disappearance became a canvas on which the town, and eventually the nation, painted their fears. The first theory to take hold was, perhaps, the most mundane, that the Harringtons had fled. The newspapers loved this one. They printed speculative articles suggesting Charles had been drowning in debt and staged his own vanishing to escape creditors. Some even hinted Eleanor had grown weary of her gilded cage, conspiring with her husband to start anew under false names. The untouched dinner, skeptics argued, was not a haunting tableau of interruption, but a performance, a carefully crafted illusion to spark mystery and misdirect. But those who knew the family scoffed. Charles was prideful, yes, but he would never abandon his estate. His identity was his wealth, and his wealth was anchored in the Harrington name. To walk away would mean admitting defeat, something he was constitutionally incapable of. And as for Eleanor, the suggestion that she would leave behind her piano, her letters, her carefully cultivated reputation, it rang false. If anything, those who knew her believed Eleanor clung to appearances so tightly that she would sooner die than slip into obscurity. The second theory, darker and more sensational, spread like wildfire in the taverns: cult activity. The Harringtons, some claimed, had become entangled with a secretive sect that held ceremonies in the nearby woods. The mansion, perched high above town, was seen as a perfect gathering place for clandestine rituals. Whispers of chanting in the night, strange fires in the distance, even livestock found mutilated near the edge of the Harrington property, all were retroactively folded into this narrative. No one could prove it, of course, but the idea was seductive. In an era of growing fascination with the occult, the suggestion that the family had been taken by forces beyond comprehension gave the mystery a mythic weight. Adding fuel to this fire were the threatening letters left in Charles's study. The phrasing, "Your family will not save you," was reinterpreted through the lens of the cult theory. Was it not merely a business rival's threat, but a warning of ritual sacrifice? Could the Harringtons have been abducted not for money, but for blood? Another theory, spread mostly by those who prowled the estate at night, was that the mansion itself hid secrets. Townsfolk spoke of hidden passageways, of tunnels dug during Prohibition for smuggling liquor, of concealed chambers where the family could have been imprisoned. One boy, daring himself to sneak into the house with friends, swore he had found a trapdoor in the cellar. When investigators later searched, they found no such thing, but the legend persisted. The mansion became less a home than a labyrinth in the public imagination, a place where entire families could vanish into its bones. Then came the supernatural explanations. Some believed the Harringtons had been cursed, punished for Charles's arrogance or Eleanor's vanity. The story of the piano music became evidence that their spirits lingered, playing the same hymn on an endless loop. A few even claimed to have seen Margaret herself, pale and drifting through the fields, calling for her mother. Children dared each other to run to the edge of the Harrington property after dark, shouting her name, listening for an answer. Most heard nothing, others swore they heard laughter. As the months dragged on, the theories grew wilder. A group of townsfolk insisted the Harringtons had been taken by foreign agents, spies seeking to silence Charles for information he had stumbled upon in his shipping business. Another swore they had been abducted by gypsies passing through, though no such group was ever found in the area. And one old farmer, half drunk on cider, insisted to his dying day that he had seen lights in the sky above the mansion the very night the family disappeared, bright, unnatural, hovering like lanterns suspended in the air. The sheriff hated the theories. Each one undermined the investigation, pulling witnesses into new directions, convincing townsfolk that facts no longer mattered. But he could not stop them. In a vacuum of truth, stories thrived. And slowly, even Carter began to feel their pull. On sleepless nights, staring at the case files spread across his desk, he wondered, what if the answer really was hidden beneath the earth, or in the trees, or in the stars? What if his failure lay not in the investigation, but in refusing to believe the unbelievable? It was during one of these long nights that Carter revisited the mansion again, this time alone. Lantern light guided him through the familiar rooms, casting long shadows across the dining table, the untouched plates still waiting. He moved into the cellar, staring at the stone walls, tapping them with the butt of his revolver. For a moment, he thought he heard a hollow echo, different from the rest. His pulse quickened. Could there truly be a passage hidden here? He pressed his ear to the wall, straining. And then he heard it. A sound. Faint, muffled. Like movement on the other side of stone. Carter froze, every muscle rigid. He held his breath, listening. The sound came again, a scrape, then silence. He staggered back, lantern shaking in his hand. He called out, his voice trembling, "Who's there?" Silence. When he returned with deputies the next day, they found nothing. The walls were solid. The floor undisturbed. Whatever Carter had heard, it left no trace. His men whispered that exhaustion had played tricks on him. But Carter knew what he had heard. Theories suddenly seemed less ridiculous. The house itself was trying to tell him something. In the following weeks, new claims poured in. A hunter in the woods reported seeing a column of smoke rising from the estate one night, though when deputies checked, the hearths were cold. A schoolteacher swore she saw a man standing in the upstairs window, the same as the farmhand had described. And then there was the strangest of all, a local boy who claimed he had found something in the creek that ran behind the mansion. A shoe, muddy and torn, with initials carved inside, T.H. The sheriff examined it himself. The shoe was real. The initials were real. If it was Thomas Harrington's, then it meant one thing: the family had not simply vanished into thin air. They had moved, or been moved. They had walked, or been dragged, out of the house. But where? And by whom? The shoe offered no further answers, only questions. And it reignited the wildest theory of all, that the Harringtons had been removed from their home not by strangers, not by cultists, but by people they knew. People who had gained their trust enough to be invited in for dinner. The theory was horrifying. If true, it meant the killer had not just struck at the Harringtons, but at the very heart of the town. And it was at this point, when suspicion was turning inward, that a startling new revelation surfaced, one that would force Carter to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the case. For months, the Harrington case had been a ghost story dressed in the clothes of an investigation. Rumors filled the void left by evidence, and the sheriff, drowning in contradictions, began to believe the case would remain unsolved forever. But then, slowly, like faint lanterns in the fog, revelations began to flicker into view. The first came in spring of 1922, when a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. The envelope was postmarked from Chicago, the handwriting elegant, almost theatrical. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 8 words scrawled in black ink: "The Harringtons are not dead. Stop searching." The note was unsigned. There were no fingerprints, no marks to identify its sender. Carter at first dismissed it as another cruel hoax, one of dozens sent by thrill-seekers across the country. But there was something unsettling about the phrasing. It wasn't the usual mockery of pranksters, nor the rambling of conspiracy theorists. It was concise, deliberate, confident. Almost as if it came from someone who knew. 2 weeks later, another revelation surfaced, this time in the form of a witness long ignored. An elderly groundskeeper named Henry Cobb came forward, claiming he had been near the Harrington estate the night of the disappearance. He had stayed silent out of fear, but after months of whispers, his conscience compelled him. He described seeing lanterns moving across the back lawn, 3, maybe 4, carried by figures who appeared to be leading others. He swore he heard Eleanor cry out, though her voice was muffled, as though bound. The image was chilling, the family escorted into the night by their captors, swallowed by the woods. Carter clung to this testimony, desperate for something concrete. But skeptics dismissed Cobb as a senile old man, eager to insert himself into the legend. Still, the detail gnawed at the sheriff, the lanterns, the muffled voice. If true, it meant the Harringtons hadn't simply vanished, they had been taken alive. Theories shifted accordingly. No longer was the debate about whether the family was gone, but why they had been removed. The cult story returned with renewed force, bolstered by Cobb's mention of the woods. Business rivals remained suspects, but the idea of an orchestrated abduction seemed increasingly plausible. Yet Carter's instincts told him the truth lay closer to home. That instinct was sharpened when he stumbled upon a new detail in the Harrington study. Reviewing evidence again, he noticed something previously overlooked, a false bottom in Charles's desk drawer. Inside was a bundle of documents, ledgers, contracts, correspondence. And among them, one letter stood out. It was from a shipping contact overseas, written in vague but suggestive terms. The contact warned Charles of consequences, if a certain deal was not honored, consequences that would extend beyond business. The sheriff felt his stomach drop. These were not idle threats from bitter locals. This was international, potentially criminal. Had Charles entangled himself with smugglers or criminal syndicates? Was the family's disappearance a punishment, a warning to others? It was a revelation that shifted the investigation from the town's borders to a global stage. But even as Carter began to chase this new lead, he was blindsided by yet another twist. Deputy records surfaced, almost by accident, revealing that the Harrington household staff, Samuel the chauffeur and Anna the maid, had each withdrawn significant sums of money from their bank accounts just days before the disappearance. Combined, the amounts equaled nearly a year's wages. Neither had been seen since that night. The implications were explosive. Had they betrayed the family? Had Samuel and Anna colluded to stage the disappearance, either for ransom or escape? The idea clashed with everything townsfolk believed about their loyalty, but the financial records were undeniable. When this detail leaked to the public, the narrative shifted again. No longer were Samuel and Anna pitted as missing victims, they became suspects. Yet this too unraveled when Carter dug deeper. The withdrawals, though unusual, had been made under pressure. Bank tellers recalled Samuel appearing nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Anna had been pale, trembling, as though forced into the act. Had they been coerced? Was someone pulling strings behind them, using the staff as pawns in a larger scheme? The sheriff's frustration mounted. Each revelation, instead of clarifying, only deepened the mystery. Every thread led to another knot. But the most shocking twist came not from the past, but the present. In late summer of 1922, a group of children dared each other to sneak into the Harrington mansion. Their laughter echoed through the halls until it was cut short by a discovery in the attic. Buried beneath old trunks and moth-eaten drapes was a trunk sealed with rusted locks. Inside, wrapped in linen, were bones. The children fled in terror, but word spread quickly. Carter rushed to the scene, dread coiling in his gut. The remains were human. Small bones, delicate, likely a child's. The sheriff felt the weight of Margaret's smile, her piano music, crashing over him. Had she been left behind, hidden in the house all along? But the coroner's report delivered yet another blow. The bones were decades old, long predating the Harringtons. They belonged not to Margaret, but to someone from the mansion's past. Who? No record could say. The find sparked whispers that the Harrington estate had always been cursed, that death had lingered in its foundations long before the family vanished. The mansion, it seemed, was not just a crime scene. It was a mausoleum of secrets. And then came the cover-up, or at least, what looked like one. Carter's investigation into Charles's international dealings led him to correspondence with state officials. He discovered, to his fury, that higher authorities had known of Charles's shady contracts months before the disappearance. Warnings had been issued quietly, but nothing was done. When Carter pressed for records, he found some conveniently missing, others heavily redacted. Someone, somewhere, wanted aspects of Charles Harrington's business buried. The sheriff began to suspect the unthinkable, that elements of the disappearance were being suppressed, not because they were unsolvable, but because powerful men had reasons to keep them unsolved. The Chicago letter. The lanterns in the field. The overseas threats. The vanished staff. The hidden bones. Each revelation seemed to point in a new direction, yet together they formed a pattern Carter could not ignore. The Harrington disappearance was no simple tragedy, no ghost story. It was a knot of betrayal, business, and blood. And just as Carter began to put the pieces together, another shock struck. A man was found wandering the countryside, disheveled, incoherent. He carried no identification, spoke little sense, but in his pocket was a ring, a signet ring engraved with the Harrington crest. When shown the ring, townsfolk gasped. It belonged to Thomas Harrington. But if the ring was real, where was Thomas? And how had it found its way into the hands of a man who claimed not to know his own name? The sheriff stared at the ring under the lantern light, his reflection warped in its polished surface. For the first time since the beginning, he felt not just fear, but dread that the truth was far stranger, and far darker, than he had ever imagined. The Harrington mansion still stood, high on its hill, long after the family that gave it life had vanished. By 1923, ivy had begun to crawl up its stone walls, the windows gathering dust, the gardens falling wild. Yet it remained more than a ruin, it was an open wound on the town. For all the investigations, the headlines, the whispered theories, the house itself remained untouched, its doors sealed by order of the sheriff. And in that silence, the mansion became louder than ever. To stand at the gates was to feel the weight of absence pressing down. The once manicured lawn had grown wild, blades of grass bending under the wind like mourners bowing their heads. The great dining table remained frozen in time, the plate still set, the food long removed but the memory of its interruption lingering. Every room was a reminder not just of what had been lost, but of how violently it had been taken. Neighbors swore the house never truly slept. On certain nights, when the moon struck the windows just right, some claimed to see silhouettes moving inside, shadows gliding across curtains in rooms that should have been empty. Others insisted they heard footsteps echoing through the halls, heavy, deliberate, as if someone were pacing. The piano story resurfaced again and again, each retelling sharper, hymns carried faintly through the dark, Margaret's music ringing out though no hands touched the keys. Children turned the estate into a test of bravery. They dared each other to run up the path and touch the front door, some swearing they heard whispers as they fled. A few bold souls sneaked inside, returning pale and shaken. One boy claimed he saw a woman at the top of the stairs, her face blurred, her dress trailing as she turned away. Another insisted he found a chair in the parlor still warm, as though someone had just risen from it. But it was not just children. Grown men, hardened farmers, admitted they avoided the road past the mansion after sunset. They spoke of an unease, a feeling of being watched from the windows. Some muttered that the land itself had soured, that nothing good could grow in the shadow of such silence. The investigators who returned for follow-up searches felt it too. Deputies who had once dismissed the house as merely empty began to falter. One recalled hearing his own name whispered in the dark, though no one was near. Another swore he left a lantern in the hallway, only to find it extinguished minutes later. They laughed off their nerves in daylight, but at night the mansion gnawed at them, piece by piece. For Sheriff Carter, the silence was the worst of all. He often returned alone, hoping to find what he had missed. But each time he crossed the threshold, the house pressed on him like a weight. The ticking clock in the dining room seemed louder in the empty air, each swing of its pendulum reminding him of the moment the Harringtons had last been seen. Time itself had frozen, yet the clock marched on, indifferent to the mystery it presided over. He would walk the hallways slowly, his boots echoing, feeling almost like an intruder in a mausoleum. The walls seemed to close in, the silence suffocating. And in that silence, he began to imagine what had happened within them, the sudden knock at the door, the interruption of dinner, the voices raised, the scuffle muffled. He pictured chairs toppling, Eleanor clutching Margaret's hand, Charles standing defiantly. But the house betrayed nothing. Its silence was unbroken, a secret it seemed determined to keep. Over time, the Harrington mansion became less a crime scene than a monument to uncertainty. Locals began to call it the house that eats, as if it had swallowed its own family whole. Travelers stopped to gaze at it, reporters posed in front of its gates, and ghost stories blossomed like weeds. Some believed the house itself had consumed the family, devouring them into its walls. Others swore the Harringtons had never left, that they lingered still, trapped in a loop of their final night, replaying the dinner over and over for eternity. The silence fed these stories. Because silence, when it should be broken by laughter, by music, by life, becomes louder than any sound. The mansion's silence was not peace, it was accusation. It accused the sheriff of failure, the town of complicity, the world of indifference. And yet, the silence also invited obsession. For many, the lack of answers was more haunting than any theory. People returned to the mansion not to find the family, but to feel the mystery pressing against them, to stand at the edge of the unsolved and stare into it. Even decades later, long after Sheriff Carter had left his post, the Harrington mansion remained a place of pilgrimage. Some came seeking ghosts. Others came seeking truth. Most left unsettled, carrying the silence with them. But for those who had been there in the beginning, who remembered the night the Harringtons vanished, the silence was not just eerie, it was unbearable. It was a reminder that the mystery was not finished. That the story had not ended. And as the years passed, whispers of cover-ups, of secrets buried deeper than the mansion's foundations, continued to spread. Every creak of its floorboards, every flicker of shadow behind its curtains, seemed to say, the Harringtons are still here. You simply refuse to see them. The house did not speak. But the silence, oh, the silence was deafening. And soon, that silence would be broken, not by answers, but by revelations that threatened to drag the mystery into even darker waters. By the mid-1920s, the Harrington case had grown cold. Files gathered dust in the sheriff's office, and Carter himself aged a decade under the weight of failure. Yet every so often, a spark of hope flared, new leads, strange coincidences, fragments that seemed poised to unravel the mystery. Each time, Carter seized them, desperate for closure. Each time, they dissolved back into silence. One of the last serious leads came from a railway worker stationed 50 miles north. He claimed that, days after the disappearance, he saw a family board a night train, a man, a woman, 2 young adults, and a girl. They were accompanied by a chauffeur, the man said, and they seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact. When shown photographs of the Harringtons, he hesitated, then nodded. Could have been them. For Carter, the testimony reopened everything. If the family had left willingly, or been forced, there should have been a trail. He scoured railway logs, interviewed ticket agents, but found nothing concrete. The family the workers saw might have been the Harringtons, or it might have been a trick of memory, a phantom projected by the weight of the case. Another lead came years later, when a trunk was found in a warehouse near the docks. Inside were clothes, monogrammed with the initials C.H. and E.H. The garments matched the Harrington style, though their origin could not be proved. More disturbing was what else lay inside: a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, its dress scorched as if by fire. Margaret had owned a doll like this. Was it hers? Or was it coincidence, another cruel echo in a story already steeped in shadows? Carter pressed on, but time was against him. Witnesses aged, memories blurred, and the town grew tired of the obsession. The mansion was still whispered about, still feared, but fewer believed the case would ever be solved. For many, the Harringtons had become less people than myth, ghosts haunting the edge of local folklore. Yet Carter could not let go. In his private journals, he recorded his late-night visits to the mansion, his belief that something was hidden in its walls, his suspicion that powerful men had suppressed key truths. He wrote of the international letters, the mysterious withdrawals by Samuel and Anna, the Chicago warning note. He circled them again and again, certain they formed a pattern he could not yet see. Then, in 1929, Carter received one final blow. A set of bones was discovered in a shallow grave miles from town. At first, hope soared: the Harringtons, finally found. But the coroner's analysis shattered those hopes. The remains belonged not to 5 people, but to one. A man. Age indeterminate, but likely middle-aged. The grave offered no answers, only more questions. Was this Charles? Was it Leonard Whitmore, or Walter Green, or another figure entangled in the story? No personal effects were found with the bones, no means of identification. The body was laid to rest without ceremony, another ghost added to the chorus. By the 1930s, Sheriff Carter retired. He left office with the case unsolved, his legacy entwined with the Harrington name. Some pitied him, others mocked him, but none denied that the mystery had consumed him. He died years later, still scribbling notes in the margins of old files, still convinced the truth lay just out of reach. The Harrington mansion remained. Through the decades, it stood as a monument to absence. Tenants came and went, briefly, never staying long. Each claimed the house unsettled them, its silence oppressive, its rooms too heavy with memory. By the 1960s it was abandoned entirely, the roof sagging, windows broken, ivy consuming its face. Teenagers used it for dares, ghost hunters for thrills, historians for lectures. But no one ever found the Harringtons. And so, the theories endured. Some swore the family had indeed fled, living under assumed names in some distant city. Others insisted they had been murdered and buried in a place yet undiscovered. A few clung to the supernatural explanations, that the house itself had taken them, swallowed them whole. The truth remained stubbornly elusive. Even today, a century later, the Harrington case is invoked whenever a family vanishes without trace. Documentaries retell the story, researchers re-examine the evidence, armchair detectives pore over maps of the mansion. Each generation returns to the silence, convinced they might be the ones to break it. Yet each leaves with the same conclusion: the house still holds its secret. What makes the Harrington disappearance so haunting is not just the lack of answers, but the intimacy of its mystery. They were not strangers on a distant battlefield or faceless victims of disaster, they were a family, gathered at their table for dinner, the most ordinary of acts. And in that moment, ordinary life was shattered, leaving only absence behind. The plates remain set in memory. The clock continues to tick. And somewhere in that silence, the Harringtons linger, not as corpses, not as fugitives, but as a question without end. Perhaps that is why the mansion unsettles those who visit. Because standing in its halls is to confront not just the Harringtons' fate, but our own deepest fear, that we, too, could vanish without explanation, leaving behind only silence, and a story others will never finish telling. And so the Harrington case closes, not with truth, but with a haunting echo. The sheriff's last words on the matter, written in a worn leather notebook discovered after his death, capture it best: the house will not speak. The town will not remember clearly. But I know this: they did not leave willingly. And whoever took them, is still out there, in one form or another. The ink on the page ends there. The silence, once again, begins. 100 years have passed since the Harrington family sat at their dining table for the last time. The world has changed beyond recognition, wars have been fought, empires have risen and fallen, technology has reshaped daily life. Yet the Harringtons remain frozen in that single moment, trapped in amber, their story preserved by silence. The mansion itself, though decayed, still stands like a monument to the unanswered. Travelers who come upon it by accident describe a strange hush that falls as they approach, as if even the birds keep their distance. The windows gape like empty eyes, the doors sag open like a mouth that once screamed and has never closed. Some see a ruin. Others see a shrine. But everyone who looks upon it feels the same thing: unease. For the town, the Harringtons are both memory and myth. Their names live on in old newspapers, in whispered ghost stories passed down to children. Parents warn their kids not to stray near the house, not because of broken beams or crumbling walls, but because of the story it carries. Some teenagers still test their courage by sneaking in after dark, daring each other to sit at the empty dining table. Most never make it past the gates. Those who do leave shaken, unable to explain why the silence feels so heavy, so personal. Historians frame the case as a lesson in how communities process fear. The absence of a family so prominent, so visible, created a vacuum that people filled with whatever explanations they could. Conspiracies, rivalries, folklore, superstition, they all became ways to make sense of the unthinkable. Yet the very lack of resolution has given the Harringtons a strange kind of immortality. Unlike solved crimes, their fate has no period at the end of its sentence. It is a story with an ellipsis, one that invites retelling. And with every retelling, the Harringtons grow more human. We imagine Charles's stern voice echoing in the halls, Margaret's fingers brushing the piano keys, Thomas pacing with frustration, Eleanor writing her secret letters, Henry drawing his dark little sketches. They are not just names in an old file. They are a family whose lives mirror our own, full of arguments and ambitions, secrets and longings. It is this humanity that makes their disappearance so unbearable. There are those who believe the silence is the answer, that the Harringtons were consumed not by a killer or a conspiracy, but by something older, darker, less comprehensible. The idea is less about ghosts than about erasure itself, that the world sometimes swallows people whole, leaving only questions behind. The mansion, in this view, is less haunted house and more scar, a reminder of how fragile our presence in this world can be. Others cling to the more tangible explanations. They argue over the evidence, the scratch marks on the doorframe, the note that read, "He is at the window again," the sightings on the train. They pore over maps, compare testimonies, analyze handwriting. Each clue becomes a lifeline, a hope that the Harringtons might still be understood, even if they are long gone. But perhaps the truth lies not in finding the answer, but in confronting what the unanswered does to us. The Harrington case forces us to sit with uncertainty, to stare into silence and admit we cannot always impose meaning on it. That is what makes the story so haunting. It is not a mystery we can solve, it is a mirror reflecting our own discomfort with the unknown. And yet, there are moments, even now, when the case feels alive. Visitors claim to hear footsteps in the mansion, the scrape of a chair across the dining room floor, the faint melody of a piano in the distance. Skeptics dismiss these as imagination, the mind bending to the weight of expectation. But those who have experienced it insist otherwise. They say the house remembers. They say it still plays the last night of the Harringtons' lives, over and over, like a needle stuck in a record groove. What lingers most is not fear of the supernatural, but empathy for the human. To sit at that table in your mind's eye, to imagine the clink of silverware, the laughter, the tensions, the lives interrupted mid-sentence, it is almost unbearable. Because it forces us to acknowledge how thin the veil is between ordinary and extraordinary, between presence and absence. Sheriff Carter, whose notebooks are now studied as part of the case, wrote that the silence of the house was louder than any scream he had ever heard. And in many ways, he was right. The silence is the legacy. It is the sound of questions that will never be answered, of voices cut off, of footsteps that never reached their destination. As night falls on the Harrington mansion today, its windows glow not with light but with the memory of it. The town below carries on, life moving forward, generations born and gone. But on the hill, time is still frozen. The plates are still set. The chairs still wait. And in that waiting, the Harringtons endure, not as bodies, not as ghosts, but as a story that refuses to fade. Perhaps that is why the case endures. Not because we expect resolution, but because we cannot bear to let it go. Because in the Harringtons, we see ourselves, fragile, flawed, fleeting. We see how easily the ordinary can dissolve into silence. And we return to the story, again and again, not to solve it, but to feel it. The final legacy of the Harrington mansion is not in what it hides, but in what it reveals about us. That we crave answers, even when none are possible. That we fear silence more than screams. That the mysteries we cannot solve become the ones that define us. And so, as the camera lingers on the darkened windows of the mansion, the story closes not with resolution, but with echo. The Harringtons are gone. Their fate is sealed in silence. But their presence remains, in every whisper, every shadow, every retelling. The mansion waits. And in its waiting, it ensures we will never truly forget.